The ring was already boxed. Lee Tae-hyun was already walking out the door. In 9 days, that ring was supposed to end a 4-year war between two empires. He never got the chance to think about that again, because the moment he stepped onto the street, his entire world stopped. Across the road, under the gold light spilling from a bakery window, a woman was crouched down, tying the shoelace of a small boy. She tilted her head back and laughed at something he said, her braids catching the streetlight. Lee Tae-hyun, 34 years old, 6 ft tall, the kind of man whose silence alone made grown executives forget their own names, forgot how to breathe. Naomi, her name left his mouth before he gave himself permission to say it. 7 years. He had spent 7 years trying to forget that exact laugh. It took 3 seconds on a sidewalk in Gangnam to undo all of it. His driver, Do-yoon, 2 steps behind him, stopped mid-sentence and followed his boss's stare across the street. Then he went very, very quiet. The woman stood, took the boy's hand, and the boy turned his head just slightly, just enough. Lee Tae-hyun, a man who had once watched a rival's entire shipping fleet burn without his expression changing, a man who had negotiated million-dollar deals at gunpoint without his pulse rising past 60, felt the ring box slip out of his fingers and hit the pavement because the boy had his eyes. Not similar, not close. His exact eyes, dark, sharp at the corners. The same eyes his own mother always said made him look like he was solving an equation that hadn't even been invented yet. "Sir," Do-yeon said, already bending down to grab the fallen box. Tae-hyun didn't answer. He was already moving toward them. Smash that like button right now. Subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from today. A quick reminder before today's story begins. Many viewers asked where they can find more Mafia boss romances without searching through dozens of videos. That's why I created the Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection, featuring 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, and 5 exclusive bonus stories not available on YouTube, but only through the collection. If you'd love to enjoy these stories anytime without ads or interruptions, you'll find the link in the description. Now, let's get started. Who exactly was this woman who could stop the coldest man in Seoul's underworld dead in his tracks on a crowded street? Why did she disappear from his life 7 years ago without a single word of explanation? No goodbye, no forwarding address. Nothing but silence where a whole relationship used to be. And the boy standing beside her, the one with Tae-hyun's exact eyes set into a small, serious face. Was that simply a cruel coincidence? The universe had decided to play on a man already drowning in an arranged marriage he never wanted? Or was it something far more dangerous, the kind of truth that could unravel an empire built on secrets and silence? Because here is what Tae-hyun did not know yet, standing frozen on that sidewalk, while his driver scrambled to retrieve a $40,000 ring off the concrete. Somewhere inside his own organization, someone had been counting on him never seeing this woman again. Someone had worked very, very hard to make sure of it. And that someone was about to find out their plan had just failed in the worst possible way. To understand what was unraveling on that street corner, you have to go back 7 years before the cold silences, before the arranged marriage, before Tae-hyun became the kind of man whose name alone made grown executives forget how to speak. 7 years ago, Lee Tae-hyun was 27 years old and already carrying the weight of an empire his father had built out of shipping containers, real estate shells, and a network of loyalty so tangled that even Tae-hyun himself didn't know the full shape of it. The Baeko Group looked, from the outside, like any other powerful Korean conglomerate. Logistics, construction, entertainment investments. It was only when you got close enough that you understood the construction crews sometimes built more than buildings, and the shipping containers sometimes carried more than furniture. Tae-hyun had grown up inside that machine. His father had taught him to read a room the way other fathers taught their sons to ride bicycles. Watch the hands, not the mouth. Trust no one fully, not even family, especially family. Love is a door someone else can walk through to get to you, so don't leave it open. He had taken that lesson and built a life out of it. Cold, controlled, untouchable. And then he met a woman who had never once in her entire life been afraid of him. Naomi Bankole was 26 years old, born in Atlanta to a Nigerian father and an American mother, and she had moved to Seoul 2 years earlier to study traditional Korean textile dyeing under a master craftsman who had agreed to take on exactly one foreign apprentice in his entire career, and only because her portfolio had made him put down his tea and actually look up. She ran a small studio in a converted hanok near Bukchon, sourcing fabric, mixing natural dyes the old way, indigo and gardenia and madder root, and she had built a small but devoted following among designers who wanted something real instead of something mass-produced. She met Tae-hyun by accident, the way the most important things in a person's life tend to happen. The Baeko Group, through one of its legitimate front companies, had commissioned a textile partnership for a hotel renovation project, and Naomi's studio had been brought in as a subcontractor on the recommendation of a designer who didn't know or didn't care exactly whose money was funding the job. Tae-hyun, who almost never personally attended supplier meetings, showed up to this one because the project manager assigned to it had quit the week before, and someone had to sign off on the final fabric selections before the deadline slipped. He walked into a small studio that smelled like dye and steam, and found a woman standing on a stool, both hands stained blue to the wrist, arguing with a delivery man about a shipment of silk that had arrived the wrong shade of indigo. "This is not navy," she was saying, holding up a bolt of fabric like evidence in a trial. "Navy has gray in it. This has green in it." I specifically wrote down the Pantone number. Did anyone actually look at the order, or did someone just guess? The delivery man looked deeply sorry he had ever taken this job. Tae-hyun, standing in the doorway in a suit that cost more than the delivery man's truck, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "She's right. That's closer to teal." Naomi turned, looked him up and down without an ounce of the deference he was used to receiving from absolutely everyone, and said, "And who are you, the color critic?" "I'm the client," he said. "Well, the client has a good eye," she said, hopping down off the stool. "Tell that to your supplier." He did that same afternoon in a phone call that ended with the supplier offering a full refund and a personal apology. Naomi found out about it 3 days later from the delivery man, who came back with the correct fabric and a story about how the powerful man from the meeting had apparently terrified an entire textile company into submission over one wrong dye lot. She showed up at his office unannounced to thank him. which absolutely no one ever did, walking past 2 assistants who tried and failed to stop her, and found him behind a desk the size of a small boat, looking for the first time anyone in that building had ever seen, mildly amused. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "You were right," he said. "Wrong is wrong. I don't like paying for wrong. Most powerful men I've met don't care about being right. They just care about being obeyed." Taehyun looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not most men. We'll see," she said, and left. It took him 4 months to admit, even to himself, that he was finding reasons to walk past her studio on his way to meetings he didn't need to attend. It took her 4 months to admit she had started saving him a cup of the bitter Nigerian coffee her aunt shipped her from Lagos, the kind nobody else in Seoul would touch, just in case he came by. What Naomi noticed about Taehyun in those early months was that he listened the way most people pretended to listen. He retained details. He remembered that she hated the smell of lavender, that her favorite color to dye with was a particular shade of yellow made from gardenia pods, that she called her grandmother every Sunday at exactly the same time, and would not take meetings during that hour. Ever. No matter who was asking. He never once made her feel small for not being Korean, for not bowing low enough, for laughing too loud in rooms full of quiet men. What Taehyun noticed about Naomi was that she was the only person in his entire life who had never once asked him for anything. Not money, not protection, not a favor passed quietly through the right channels. She argued with him about dye lots and corrupt textile suppliers and the correct way to season jollof rice, and she had absolutely no idea, for a very long time, what kind of world he actually came from. He fell for her before he understood what was happening. And by the time he understood, it was already too late to stop it. He proposed nothing formal in those early days. There was no ring, no grand declaration. There was simply a Tuesday evening, 8 months in, when he sat in her studio while she dyed a length of silk, a deep, impossible indigo, and he said, without any of the careful control he used in every other sentence of his life, "I don't know how to do this. Whatever this is, I've never wanted to before." Naomi set down the fabric, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "You're doing fine," she said. "You're already doing it." His mother, Han Mi-suk, found out 3 weeks later, and her reaction was exactly what Taehyun expected and dreaded in equal measure. She did not yell. She never yelled. She simply asked one question in a voice so calm it could cut glass. "Does she know what we are?" "No," Taehyun admitted. "Then she doesn't know what she's standing in front of." His cousin, Choi Dae-sung, second in command of the Bae-ko group, and the man Taehyun's father had trusted more than almost anyone outside their own bloodline, took a different approach entirely. He smiled, clapped Taehyun on the shoulder and said, "She's good for you. Lighter. Keep her around as long as you want, cousin. Just don't be stupid about it." Taehyun should have heard the warning buried inside that sentence. He didn't. He was too busy, for the first time in his adult life, being happy. For nearly a year, Lee Taehyun lived something that almost resembled an ordinary life. He learned to sit on the floor of a tiny Hanok studio without complaining about his suit. He learned that Naomi sang under her breath while she worked, off-key and completely unself-conscious. Old Fela Kuti songs mixed with whatever was playing on the radio. He learned the specific weight of her hand in his during the rare evenings, when no one from either of their worlds was watching. She learned that he flinched just slightly at sudden loud noises, a habit from a childhood she never fully understood the cause of. She learned that when he was stressed, truly stressed, the kind of stress he never let show on his face, his thumb would move in slow, unconscious circles against the inside of his opposite wrist, like he was checking for a pulse that might have stopped. She learned to recognize that small motion the way you learn to read weather. And she learned, eventually, that it almost always meant something was about to go wrong, even when he insisted nothing was. But love, inside Taehyun's world, was never simply love. It was leverage waiting to be discovered by the wrong person. The rumors started small, the way rumors inside organizations like the Bai Co group always did. A whispered comment that the young heir's foreign girlfriend was asking too many questions about his business. A suggestion planted carefully in a casual conversation that perhaps she was not as innocent as she appeared, that perhaps someone, a rival family, a foreign intelligence contact, a journalist looking for a way in, had placed her deliberately in Taehyun's path. None of it was true. All of it was designed to feel true, the way the best lies always are, built from just enough real detail to survive a first glance. Naomi began to notice things shifting around her, without understanding why. A studio assistant suddenly stopped showing up for work, frightened off by a conversation no one would explain to her. A landlord who raised her rent without warning, then dropped the increase the moment she threatened to leave, as though someone had simply wanted to see how she would react under pressure. Phone calls that disconnected the moment she answered. A feeling persistent and exhausting of being watched by people who disappeared the instant she turned to look at them. She told Taehyun. He believed her completely, and that belief frightened him more than anything else in his life ever had, because it meant someone close to him, someone with real access, was working against the one person he had never once had to be careful around. He started investigating quietly, the way he investigated everything, through channels his cousin had taught him personally. And that, more than anything else, turned out to be his fatal mistake, because the person feeding him false leads, the person assuring him the threats against Naomi, were coming from a rival syndicate testing his weaknesses. The person who promised again and again that he was handling it, that Taehyun should focus on the business and let him manage the rest, was Choi Dae-sung himself. Dae-sung had watched his cousin fall in love with a foreign woman, with a controlled, simmering panic he never once let show on his face. Not because he hated Naomi personally. He barely thought about her as a person at all. He thought about her as a variable, an unpredictable, uncontrollable variable in a succession plan he had spent a decade quietly engineering. Taehyun, softened by love, was Taehyun harder to manage, harder to predict, less useful as the disciplined heir the Baeko group needed to survive its current war with the O family's rival network. An alliance marriage with Chairman O's daughter would end that war permanently and cement Dae-sung's own position as the man who delivered peace. A foreign girlfriend with no political value whatsoever threatened to derail all of it for nothing more than feelings. So Choi Dae-sung made a decision, quietly, efficiently, the way he made every decision. And he began the long, patient work of making sure Naomi Bankolo disappeared from his cousin's life before she could become permanent. He started with whispers in her direction, a warning delivered by a man she never met that continuing to see Tae-hyun would put her in danger she couldn't imagine. A forged message slipped to her through a contact she trusted, suggesting Tae-hyun had been seen with another woman, a woman from his own world, the kind of woman his family actually wanted for him. A second warning, more direct this time, that if she truly cared about her own safety, she would leave Seoul and never look back. And that if she tried to tell Tae-hyun any of this, the consequences would fall on people she loved back home in Atlanta. Naomi did not know in those final terrifying weeks that the man delivering these threats answered to Dae-sung. She only knew that her world had become unsafe in a way she could not explain to the one person who might have actually believed her. Because every time she tried to bring it to Tae-hyun, Dae-sung intercepted the conversation first, smoothing it over, explaining it away, buying himself just enough time to finish what he'd started. And then she found out she was pregnant. She sat alone in her studio for 3 days after the test came back positive, staring at the indigo stains on her own hands, trying to decide what kind of world she was about to bring a child into. A world where she was being threatened by people she couldn't see for reasons no one would explain, attached to a man whose family had never once acknowledged her existence beyond a single icy question about whether she knew what they were. She decided to tell him. She really did. She had the conversation planned, word for word, for the evening he came home from a trip to Busan. She never got the chance. 2 nights before he returned, the final threat arrived, delivered in person this time by a man who showed her photographs, doctored just enough to look real, of Tae-hyun at a hotel with another woman. Oh Soo-min herself, smiling, intimate, staged with a precision that took weeks to engineer. The man told her, calmly, the way you deliver bad weather news, that the engagement between the 2 families had already been quietly arranged, that Tae-hyun had known for months, that she had simply been a convenient distraction before his real life began. It wasn't true. Not one frame of it was true, but it was built from exactly enough real fear, real isolation, and real exhaustion that Naomi, alone, pregnant, and terrified in a country 8,000 miles from her family, believed it. She packed 2 suitcases in a single night. She left no note for Tae-hyun, because what was there to say to a man who had, in her mind, already chosen someone else, while letting her be hunted in the shadows of a life he never fully let her see. She bought a one-way ticket to Atlanta with money she had been saving for new dye equipment, and by the time the sun rose over Seoul the next morning, she was already gone. Tae-hyun came home from Busan to a studio stripped bare and a phone number that no longer existed. He searched for her with every resource an empire like his could offer. Private investigators, contacts at the airport, favors called in from people who owed him their lives. The trail went cold in Atlanta within 3 weeks, swallowed by a city of 6 million people and a woman determined never to be found by anyone connected to Seoul again. Dae-sung, watching his cousin search with a desperation that frightened even him, told Tae-hyun what he needed to hear. She left because she got scared. She left because the life was too much for her. She left because, deep down, she never really wanted any of it. Tae-hyun eventually stopped searching. Not because he stopped caring, but because there was nothing left to search for. He buried what he felt the only way he knew how, by becoming exactly the kind of man his father had raised him to be, colder, sharper, untouchable. He told himself for 7 long years that he had simply lost a woman who decided she didn't love him enough to stay. He had no idea he had lost a son. And he had absolutely no idea, standing frozen on a sidewalk in Gangnam with a fallen engagement ring at his feet, that the man who orchestrated all of it was still standing beside him every single day, smiling, loyal, trusted completely, waiting nervously for a phone call, telling him whether his cousin had finally seen something he was never supposed to see. Because somewhere across the city, Choi Do-sung's phone was about to ring. Do-yun picked the velvet box up off the concrete, brushed it against his sleeve, and looked up to find his boss already 3 steps ahead of him, weaving through pedestrians with a focus Do-yun had only ever seen Tae-hyun use right before he destroyed someone in a negotiation. "Sir," Do-yun said, jogging to catch up. "Sir, the ring." "Keep it," Tae-hyun said, not turning around. "Keep it where? In my pocket?" "Sir, this ring costs more than my apartment. If I drop it, my mother will disown me before the insurance company even calls back." Tae-hyun didn't answer. He had stopped at the edge of the crosswalk, eyes locked on the bakery across the street, on the woman now guiding the small boy by the shoulder toward a side street, the 2 of them disappearing around the corner. The way a dream disappears the second you try to hold on to it. "That's her," Tae-hyun said quietly. "That's Naomi." Do-yun, who had been with Tae-hyun for 9 years and had heard her name exactly twice in all that time, both times in moments of complete silence afterward, felt his stomach drop. The Naomi from before. "And the boy?" Tae-hyun said. "What boy?" Tae-hyun finally turned to look at him, and Do-yun, who genuinely feared very few things in this world, took an involuntary step back at whatever was sitting in his boss's expression. "The boy has my eyes, Do-yun." "Sir, lots of people have similar eyes. It's called genetics. Being generic, I have my uncle's nose, and he's not even technically related to me. He just married into the family, and apparently noses are contagious now. Do-yun, I'm saying this because you look like you're about to do something insane. And I would like to remind you that you have a fitting for your wedding suit in 40 minutes. And Chairman O's people specifically requested punctuality. And last time we were 10 minutes late. You made me sit through a 40-minute lecture about respect. Cancel it. Cancel the fitting? Cancel everything for tonight." Do-yun stared at him. Then he sighed, the long, theatrical sigh of a man who had clearly decided, somewhere around year 3 of this job, that arguing with Lee Tae-hyun when his face looked like that was about as useful as arguing with the weather. Fine. But when Director Choi calls asking why the future groom skipped his own fitting, I'm telling him you saw a ghost, because frankly, sir, that's exactly what your face looks like right now. A ghost. A very expensive, very well-dressed ghost. By the time Tae-hyun reached the side street, Naomi and the boy were gone. Swallowed into the evening crowd, the way Seoul swallows everyone eventually, he stood there for a long moment, breathing harder than the short walk should have caused, replaying the boy's face over and over in his mind. The eyes, the serious, unhurried way the child had turned his head, like nothing in the world needed to startle him. Tae-hyun had looked exactly like that as a boy in the one surviving photograph his mother kept of him at age 6, standing stiff and unsmiling beside his father at some company function neither of them wanted to attend. He thought about the math without wanting to. 7 years since Naomi disappeared. A boy who looked to be somewhere around 6, maybe 7 years old. The numbers lined up with a precision that made his chest tighten. He spent the rest of that night doing something he had not done in years, something that would have horrified his entire organization if they had known. He went home alone, sent his security detail away, and sat in the dark of his penthouse with a glass of whiskey he never touched, turning a single thought over and over in his mind until it had worn a groove. At 5 a.m., he called Do-yun and told him to find out everything he could, quietly, about a Nigerian-American woman named Naomi Bankole, who had recently returned to Seoul. Quietly meaning? Do-yun asked carefully. The kind of quietly where nobody in the company finds out, or the kind of quietly where only 12 people find out instead of 200? The first kind. That's going to be hard, sir. You know how this company works. Everything filters up to Director Choi eventually. He has people everywhere. It's actually a little impressive in a deeply unsettling way. Then make sure it doesn't filter up to him, Tae-hyun said. Not yet. Not until I know what I'm dealing with. Do-yun looked at him for a long moment, something careful crossing his face. You really think it's true that the boy is yours? I don't think anything yet, Tae-hyun said. I need to know. What Tae-hyun did not say, what he barely let himself think even in the privacy of his own head, was that some part of him had already decided, the moment he saw that boy's eyes, that he was not going to marry Osumin in 9 days, no matter what the answer turned out to be. Naomi found out he had seen them 3 days later, in the worst possible way. She was at the small fabric workshop she had reopened on the outskirts of Itaewon, a much smaller, much warier version of the studio she'd run 7 years earlier, when her friend BC burst through the door, holding her phone like it was about to explode. BC had known Naomi since their first year in Seoul, 2 foreign women navigating a city that alternately welcomed and quietly excluded them. And she had the specific gift of saying the exact wrong thing at the exact right volume. Naomi, Naomi, you need to sit down. I'm already sitting down, BC. I'm dying, Silk. What is it? Keon's after-school teacher just called me because she couldn't reach you, and she said a man came to the pickup gate asking about Keon by name. Naomi's hands went very still over the dye vat. What man? Tall, Korean, expensive suit. The teacher said he didn't try to take him or anything. He just stood at the fence and watched for a few minutes, and then left when security noticed him. Naomi's heart was already pounding before BC finished the sentence, but it was the next detail that made the blood drain completely from her face. She said he was asking the front desk if a boy named Keon Bankole attended the school. She said when they told him to leave, he just stood there a second longer, like he wasn't done looking. And then he said, and I'm quoting exactly what she told me, he said, "Tell his mother Tayo came by." Naomi did not remember walking out of the workshop. She did not remember the taxi ride. She remembered, with a clarity that scared her, standing at the school gate 20 minutes later, scooping Keon into her arms so hard he laughed and asked if she'd missed him that much. and she remembered thinking, with a kind of cold, ancient dread, "He found us." After 7 years, he actually found us. She had spent 7 years building a wall around herself and her son, so high and so thick that she had genuinely started to believe, in her better moments, that the wall would simply hold forever. She had a small life, a small business, a small, fierce family of 2, plus BC, plus a handful of people in Seoul's expat community, who knew her only as the quietly talented woman who dyed fabric and never talked about Keon's father. She had told Keon, when he was old enough to start asking, that his father lived far away and that some adults made complicated choices, and she had hated every single word of that explanation the moment it left her mouth, because it wasn't even close to the truth. And she didn't have the truth to give him, only the version of events that had driven her halfway across the world. 7 years pregnant and terrified. She had never told Tae-hyun about Kian, because by the time she understood she was carrying his child, she believed completely that he had already chosen someone else, that the woman in the photographs was his future, that the threats against her life had been the price of standing in that future's way. She left to protect a child she hadn't even met yet from a danger she believed Tae-hyun himself had created, even if not directly with his own hands. Now he was standing at her son's school, saying his name to strangers, and Naomi understood with terrible clarity that the wall she had spent 7 years building had just cracked straight down the middle. That night, after Kian had finally fallen asleep, clutching the stuffed elephant he'd had since infancy, Naomi sat on the floor of her small apartment with BC and a bottle of wine. Neither of them was actually drinking, and she said the thing she had not said out loud in 7 years. "He's going to find out Kian is his." BC didn't ask if Naomi was sure. She had met Kian. She had seen the photograph of Tae-hyun that occasionally surfaced in Korean business news. The cold, sharp-jawed air of some company everyone whispered about, but no one explained clearly. The resemblance, when you knew to look for it, was impossible to miss. "What are you going to do?" BC asked. "I don't know," Naomi said. "Run again, maybe." "Naomi, I know how that sounds." Naomi wrapped her arms around her knees, looking smaller in that moment than BC had seen her look in years. "But the last time I stayed and tried to fight for the truth, I ended up alone, pregnant, 8,000 miles from my own mother, hiding from people I never even saw coming. I'm not doing that to Kayan. I'm not putting him anywhere near that world." "What if it's not what you think it was?" BC said carefully. "What if the threats, the photos, all of it, what if none of that actually came from him?" Naomi was quiet for a long time. "Then someone lied to me for months and ruined both our lives for no reason. And I don't know which version of that story scares me more." She did not run. Whatever else Naomi Bankole was, she had never once in her life been the kind of woman who ran simply because the ground started shaking. She stayed because Kayan had a life here now. Friends, a school he loved, a small garden plot at the community center where he insisted, with absolute 7-year-old confidence, that his tomatoes were going to be the biggest in Seoul this year. She stayed, and she waited for Tae-hyung to come find her properly, because some stubborn, exhausted part of her knew, with total certainty, that he would. He came 4 days later, alone, no driver, no security, dressed in plain dark clothes instead of his usual tailored suits, standing outside her workshop door at exactly the hour she closed up for the evening. Naomi saw him through the glass before he knocked. And for one long moment, neither of them moved. He looked different than she remembered, older around the eyes in a way that had nothing to do with actual age. Still sharp, still controlled, but there was something underneath it now. Something that hadn't been there 7 years ago. A kind of exhausted weariness she recognized instantly because she carried the exact same thing in her own face every time she looked in a mirror. She opened the door because there was nothing else left to do. "You found us," she said. Her voice came out flatter and colder than she expected, but it held. "I saw him," Taehyun said, "on the street by accident. I wasn't looking for you. And then you went looking for him at his school." "Yes." "That's not by accident anymore, Taehyun. That's a choice. I needed to know." "Know what?" He looked at her steadily, and for a moment all the careful distance either of them had built over 7 years simply evaporated, leaving two people standing in a doorway with the truth sitting between them, enormous and unavoidable. "Is he mine?" Naomi felt something break loose in her chest, grief and fury arriving at the exact same moment, indistinguishable from each other. "Are you serious right now? You disappear for 7 years. You let me believe you'd already moved on to someone else before I even left the country. And now you show up asking if he's yours like you have any right to an answer." "I never moved on to anyone." Taehyun said, and something in his voice cracked just slightly. The first crack Naomi had heard in his composure in 7 years. "I searched for you for months. I had nothing to find. You disappeared like you'd never existed. I disappeared because I was terrified, Taehyun. Men I never met threatened me. Someone showed me photographs of you with Oh Soo-min, intimate photographs, told me the engagement was already arranged, told me you'd known about it for months, and let me believe otherwise. I was alone and pregnant in a city 8,000 miles from my mother, and I had no one to trust, so I left." Taehyun went very still. "What photographs?" "Don't," Naomi said. "Don't act like you don't know." "I'm not acting like anything," he said, and his voice had dropped low and dangerous, in a way Naomi had never once heard directed at her, only ever in the rare moments she'd witnessed it at men who had crossed him in business. "I have never been photographed with Oh Soo-min in any way that could be called intimate. Not 7 years ago, not now. Whoever showed you that was lying to you, and I need to know who." Naomi searched his face for the performance she expected to find there, the careful diplomatic deflection of a powerful man caught in an old lie. She did not find it. What she found instead frightened her more than anything he could have said, because it looked exactly like the truth. "Someone inside my organization fed you false information," Taehyun said slowly, working through it as he spoke, like a man finally turning over a stone he should have turned over years ago. "Someone close enough to know things about my schedule, my movements, close enough to fabricate photographs convincing enough to make you believe them. Someone who wanted you gone before I could find out you were pregnant. Why would anyone want that? Because a foreign girlfriend was a liability to a marriage alliance that was already being quietly arranged behind my back." Tai-hyun said, and his hand, without him seeming to notice, had begun moving in slow, unconscious circles against the inside of his opposite wrist. A son outside that alliance would have been an even bigger liability. An heir who could complicate succession. Someone wanted both problems gone permanently, and they were patient enough and close enough to me to make it happen without my noticing for 7 years. Naomi felt the floor of her certainty shift under her feet. Who? I don't know yet, Tai-hyun said. But I'm going to find out. He looked past her then, into the small apartment behind the workshop, where the light from Kayan's bedroom spilled faintly into the hallway. Can I see him? He asked, and for the first time in 7 years, Lee Tae-hyun's voice sounded less like the air of an empire and more like a man simply asking for the one thing he had never known he was missing. Naomi looked at him for a long, long moment, weighing 7 years of grief against the rawness sitting plainly on his face, a rawness she had genuinely never seen on him before, not once in all the time she'd known him. Not tonight, she said finally. I need to think. I need to be sure. I understand. Do you? No, he admitted. But I'm going to try to. He left without pressing further, which surprised her more than anything else that night, and Naomi stood in the doorway long after his car had pulled away, replaying the look on his face when he'd asked about the photographs, the genuine, dawning horror of a man realizing he had been betrayed by someone he trusted completely, for far longer than he ever imagined. Before we continue, a quick note for everyone who loves these Mafia boss romance stories. I've bundled 20 of our most loved Afro-Korean romance stories into the Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. You'll get all 15 complete stories, 20 audiobook versions, plus 5 exclusive bonus stories you won't find on YouTube. If you'd love to enjoy these stories anytime without ads or interruptions, you'll find the link in the description below. Back at the Baeko Group's headquarters, on the 42nd floor of a glass tower that controlled far more of Seoul than its public filings would ever admit, Choi Dae-sung sat behind his desk, reading a short, encrypted message from a contact he had not needed to use in 7 years. He saw them. He's asking questions about Naomi. He went to the boys' school. Dae-sung read the message twice, set his phone face down on the desk, and sat in silence for a long moment, his expression giving away absolutely nothing to the empty room around him. Then he picked the phone back up and began typing a message of his own, one that would set in motion the very thing he had spent 7 years trying to prevent from ever happening. Because Choi Dae-sung had not survived this long inside the Baeko Group by panicking when a plan started to crack. He had survived by making sure that whoever threatened to expose him never lived long enough to finish the sentence. The wedding preparations did not slow down simply because the groom had disappeared into a sudden, unexplained silence. If anything, they accelerated. The way machinery left running without supervision tends to speed up rather than stop. Chairman Oh Byung-cheol called Tae-hyun's office 4 times in 2 days, his voice growing colder with each unanswered message, until finally he called Choi Dae-sung directly, a man he trusted, a man whose calm efficiency had brokered this entire alliance from the very beginning. Your cousin missed his own fitting, Chairman Oh said. No greeting, no pleasantries. My daughter is asking questions I cannot answer. Tell me there is nothing to worry about, Director Choi. There is nothing to worry about, Chairman, Dae-sung said smoothly. Tae-hyun has been dealing with a sensitive business matter. He'll be ready by the ceremony. I give you my word. He hung up the phone and sat very still for a moment. The calm mask he wore for every single person in his life, slipping just slightly, just for himself, in the privacy of his own office. He had built this alliance for 10 years. He had buried a young woman's entire life 7 years ago to protect it, had watched his cousin search for her with a grief so total it had genuinely worried him at the time, not out of guilt, but out of the practical concern that grief that deep might never properly heal into the discipline the family needed from its heir. He had told himself every single year since that he had made the correct decision, the necessary decision, the kind of decision a real leader makes when sentiment threatens the survival of everything. He was not about to let one accidental sighting on a sidewalk undo a decade of careful work. He picked up his phone again and made a call to a man whose name appeared nowhere in any of the Baeko Group's official records. A man he used exactly twice before, both times for problems too delicate to be solved through ordinary channels. I need a situation handled, Dae-sung said quietly, quickly and quietly. There's a child involved. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. How quietly? Quiet enough that no one ever finds the connection back to me, Dae-sung said. I don't want him hurt. I want him removed. Somewhere far from Seoul. Somewhere his mother can be convinced to follow without asking too many questions about why. And if she doesn't follow quietly, Dae-sung's jaw tightened. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But it won't come to that. Frightened mothers run. That's what they do. 3 days later, on a bright Saturday morning that smelled like spring rain, and the chestnut blossoms lining the community garden's fence, 6-year-old Keon Bangkol was kneeling in the dirt, carefully inspecting the small green tomatoes climbing up his bamboo stake, when a man he had never seen before crouched down beside him and said in friendly accented English, "Those are looking very good. Your mother around here somewhere?" Naomi was 30 effort away, deep in a conversation with the garden coordinator about water schedules. Her back turned for exactly the length of time it took a careful man to make a careful mistake. "She's right there," Keon said, pointing without looking up from his tomatoes. The way children do when they have absolutely no reason to be afraid of a stranger at a community garden on a sunny Saturday. "You're a smart kid," the man said. "Want to see something cool? I've got a puppy in my car. Real friendly one." Keen, who had been asking his mother for a dog for 2 straight years, with the relentless persistence of a child who genuinely believed repetition was a legal strategy, looked up with sudden, total interest. What kind of puppy? It was Bissy, arriving late to help with the garden plot and walking up from the opposite direction, who noticed the man crouched beside Keen and felt something instinctive and wrong move through her stomach before her mind had even fully processed why. She quickened her pace. "Keen," she called out, sharper than she meant to. The man straightened up fast, far too fast for someone who'd simply been admiring a child's tomato plants. And Bissy watched him glance once, quickly toward a dark sedan idling at the edge of the garden's parking area. engine running, windows tinted. "Hey there," Bissy said, walking directly up to him with the bright, deliberately loud friendliness of a woman who had decided in half a second that the only safe move was to make as much noise as possible. "I don't think we've met. Are you new to the garden plots? I run the orientation. You'd have signed up with me." "Just passing through," the man said, already backing away. "Funny, I know everyone who passes through this garden," Bissy said, not moving, blocking the angle between the man and the child with her own body, without seeming to do it on purpose. "Naomi. Hey, Naomi, come meet someone." Naomi turned, took one look at the stranger's face, going pale, and the way he was already retreating toward the parked car, and every protective instinct in her body fired at once. She crossed the garden in seconds, scooped Keon up against her hip despite his protest that he was in fact 6.5 and didn't need to be carried, and watched the man practically run the last few steps to the sedan, which pulled away from the curb before the door had even fully closed. She stood there, shaking, holding her son, while BC caught her breath beside her. "He asked about a puppy," Keon said, frowning, more annoyed about the missed puppy than alarmed about anything else. "I wanted to see the puppy." Naomi did not sleep that night. She called Tae-hyun for the first time since he'd left her doorway 4 days earlier, her voice shaking in a way she hated, and told him exactly what had happened. There was a long, terrible silence on the other end of the line. "I'm coming," Tae-hyun said. "Now, don't open the door for anyone but me." Tae-hyun arrived at Naomi's apartment 40 minutes later, and the version of him standing in her doorway that night bore almost no resemblance to the careful, controlled man who had stood there 4 days earlier asking permission to see his son. His eyes were dark with something Naomi had never once seen in him in all the time she'd known him. Something close to violence held barely in check. "Tell me everything," he said. "Every detail. What he looked like, what car, what he said." Naomi told him, and BC, standing protectively beside Keon in the kitchen doorway, added every detail she'd noticed: the man's accent, the dark sedan, the tinted windows, the way he'd glanced toward the car. The moment he realized he'd been seen, Tae-hyun listened with the stillness of a predator processing a scent, and when Naomi finished, he pulled out his phone and made a single call that lasted less than 30 seconds. His voice flat and absolutely without mercy. "Pull every security camera within 4 blocks of the community garden on 12th Street. Cross-reference any black sedan with tinted windows against vehicles registered to anyone connected to this organization. Anyone, no matter how distant the connection. I want a name by morning." He hung up and looked at Naomi. Whoever did this knew where Kayan would be. That's not random. That's someone who's been watching. Watching since when? "I don't know yet," Tae-hyun said, and for the first time, something genuinely frightened crossed his face. "But I'm starting to think this didn't start 4 days ago when I saw you on the street. I think it started 7 years ago, and whoever is behind it has been managing this very, very carefully ever since." He stayed that night, sitting in Naomi's small living room, while she finally, after 7 years, let him in to say goodnight to a son who had no idea who he actually was. only that his mother's old friend was being unusually quiet and unusually careful with him, the way adults are when something serious is happening that they don't want to scare a child with. Kayan looked up at Tae-hyun from where he was tucked into bed. That same serious, unhurried expression on his small face, and asked with total 6-year-old directness, "Are you the puppy man's friend?" "No," Tae-hyun said, his voice rough. "I would never let anyone hurt you. I promise you that." In considered this with the gravity of a much older person. "Okay," he said simply, and closed his eyes, already half asleep, completely unaware that the man standing in his doorway had just made him a promise that was about to cost him everything he'd ever built. By morning, the report came back, and it broke Tae-hyun's world apart for the second time in a week. The sedan belonged, on paper, to a shell logistics company with no obvious connection to the Beiko group. But the security footage from the parking structure, 2 blocks from the garden, showed the same car arriving 40 minutes before the incident. And the man who'd gotten out of the passenger seat to make a phone call before walking toward the garden was instantly recognizable to anyone who had worked in Tae-hyun's organization for more than a year. It was a man named Ahn. A fixer Choi Dae-sung had personally used twice before for problems considered too delicate for the family's official security staff. Tae-hyun stared at the photograph for a long time, the careful architecture of his entire understanding of his own family collapsing in real time. "Sir," Do-yoon said quietly, standing beside him in the dim light of the security office, "there's more." He slid a second file across the desk, older records his team had spent the last 4 days quietly digging through. The kind of digging that required calling in every favor Tae-hyun had ever extended, and a few he hadn't known he was owed. Phone logs from 7 years ago. Transfer records of payments made to a small-time forgery specialist, the exact kind of specialist who could doctor a photograph convincingly enough to fool a frightened, isolated young woman with no reason to question it. A series of intercepted messages between that same forgery specialist and a number registered 7 years ago to Choi Dae-sung's personal phone. Tae-hyun sat in absolute silence for nearly a full minute, the truth settling into him slowly, like a stone sinking through deep water. His cousin, the man who had taught him half of what he knew about running this family, the man who had stood beside him at his father's funeral, who had clapped him on the shoulder and told him Naomi was good for him. Lighter. Keep her around as long as you wanted. Just don't be stupid about it. That same man had spent 7 years systematically destroying the only happiness Tae-hyun had ever known. Had separated him from a pregnant woman through fabricated photographs and manufactured threats, had let him grieve in silence for a relationship Dae-sung himself had murdered, and had now, 4 days ago, sent a man to lure a 6-year-old child into a car with the promise of a puppy. "Why?" Tae-hyun said quietly. Not really a question, more a sound a man makes when the world stops making sense the way he thought it did. "Succession?" Do-yoon said gently, because someone had to say it out loud. If you'd had a son outside the political marriage 7 years ago, it would have complicated everything Director Choi had been building toward, an heir with no political value to the O alliance. A scandal involving a foreign mistress and an illegitimate child. right when he needed you, stable, predictable, and bound to the right family. He couldn't control that variable, sir. So he removed it. Tae-hyun stood up so fast, his chair nearly toppled backward. And for the first time in his entire adult life, Do-yun watched the legendary, untouchable composure of Lee Tae-hyun shatter completely, replaced by something raw and furious, and entirely, dangerously human. He tried to take my son, Tae-hyun said, his voice low and shaking. He tried to put a 6-year-old boy in a car. Sir, we need to be careful about how we move on this. If Director Choi realizes we know. I don't care what he realizes, Tae-hyun said. I am done being careful for this family. He walked out of that office, called Naomi, and told her, in a voice stripped of every careful diplomatic instinct he'd spent 34 years cultivating, exactly what his team had found. Naomi sat on her kitchen floor and cried for the first time in 7 years. Not from grief this time, but from a kind of furious, vindicated relief. The relief of finally understanding that the man who had broken her trust so completely had never actually been the man standing in front of her. The man who had broken her trust had a name now, and that name was not Tae-hyun. What happens now? She asked, when she could finally speak again. Now, Tae-hyun said, I end the engagement publicly today, and I make sure every single person in this organization knows exactly why. Tae-hyun, that will start a war inside your own family. There's already a war, he said. I've just been too blind to see it for 7 years. It's time I stopped being blind. Within hours, word reached Choi Dae-sung that his cousin had cancelled a private meeting with Chairman Oh, and instead called an emergency gathering of the Baeko Group's senior leadership, a meeting Dae-sung himself had not been informed of in advance, which had never, not once in 10 years, happened before. He sat in his office, watching the message come through, his calm mask cracking for the first time in front of an audience of exactly no one, and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had spent his life reading rooms before anyone else, that his careful, decade-long arc, Ekcha, had just been discovered. He picked up his phone with hands that were, for the first time in years, not entirely steady, and dialed a number he had hoped he would never need to use again. It's compromised, he said quietly. Move to contingency. We do this my way now. Across the city, in a boardroom on the 40th floor of the Baeko Group's headquarters, Lee Tae-hyun stood in front of every senior leader his father had ever trusted, and said the words that would change the entire structure of his family's empire forever. 7 years ago, he began, his voice carrying through the silent room with absolute, unshakable steadiness. Someone inside this organization decided that my happiness was an acceptable price to pay for political convenience. That someone, Tae-hyun continued, fabricated evidence to drive away a woman I loved. That someone let me believe for 7 years that she simply chose to leave me, and 4 days ago, after I discovered the truth, that same someone sent a man to lure my 6-year-old son into a car at a community garden. The room had gone completely, absolutely silent. My son, Tae-hyun said again, letting the words land, watching understanding ripple across the faces of men who had known him his entire life. I have a son. His name is Keon, He is 6 years old, and as of this moment, he is the only thing in this entire empire I actually care about protecting. He looked, finally, directly at the empty chair at the far end of the table. The chair that belonged to Choi Dae-sung. The chair that had been, quietly, deliberately, left empty by a man who already understood exactly what was about to be said in that room. The engagement to the Oh family is over, Tae-hyun said. Effective immediately. And I am formally accusing director Choi Dae-sung of orchestrating the betrayal that drove Naomi Bankole out of Seoul 7 years ago, and of attempting to abduct my son 4 days ago. I expect a full investigation, and I expect this family to choose right now, today, whether it still believes in the values my father actually built this company on, or what has simply been hiding behind his name for 10 years, while someone else quietly rewrote everything underneath it. No one in that room spoke for nearly 30 full seconds, and somewhere across the city, in a parking structure 2 blocks from a community garden, the same dark sedan with tinted windows was already idling outside a small fabric workshop in Itaewon, waiting for a signal that after everything that had just happened in that boardroom was never going to come the way its passengers expected. Naomi was alone in the workshop when the call came in from Doyen. His voice tight and urgent in a way she had never once heard from him in the handful of times they'd spoken since Tae-hyun came back into her life. "Get away from the front windows," Doyen said. "Now, Naomi." "Where's Ki-in?" "He's at after-school care. Pickup isn't for another hour. What's happening?" "There's a car outside your shop. The same plates from the garden incident. I'm sending security to you right now and to the school. But I need you to lock the door and stay away from the front." Naomi's hands were already shaking as she reached for the deadbolt, her mind racing toward Ki-in, toward the school, toward every terrible possibility a mother's imagination can construct in under 3 seconds. She had just thrown the lock when the front door rattled hard against its frame. Once, twice, a third time with enough force that the old glass panel shuddered in its setting. "Open it," a man's voice said from outside. Calm in the specific, terrible way that calm becomes more frightening than shouting ever could be. "We just want to talk." Naomi backed away from the door, grabbing the heaviest thing within reach. A length of bamboo dye stirring rod that had hung on her wall for years. More decoration than tool at this point. And held it like it might actually do something useful against whatever was waiting outside. The glass panel finally gave way under a hard kick, and a man stepped through the broken frame. The same man from the garden. The puppy man. His friendly, accented voice from that Saturday morning, completely gone now, replaced by something flat and businesslike. "This doesn't have to be difficult," he said, stepping carefully over the glass. "Director Choi just wants you out of Seoul. You and the boy. A flight, relocation funds, a clean start somewhere far from here. You disappear quietly. This all goes away." "I'm not going anywhere," Naomi said, gripping the dye rod tighter, her voice far steadier than she felt. That wasn't really a request. He took a step toward her, and Naomi, 7 years removed from the last time she'd genuinely feared for her life, found something old and fierce rising up inside her, the exact same instinct that had once made her stand on a chair in Atlanta and argue down a landlord twice her size over a broken lease. Except this time, the stakes were not an apartment. They were her son's entire future. She swung the bamboo rod with everything she had. It connected hard against the man's forearm as he raised it to block, and the sound he made was less pain than surprise. The surprise of a man who had clearly expected this to be easier than it was turning out to be. Naomi backed toward the rear exit. Rod raised again, shouting for help, with a volume that brought the elderly tailor 2 shops down running, with a phone all ready to his ear. And that was the exact moment the front door behind the intruder exploded inward properly this time. Not from a kick, but from Tae-hyun's shoulder, followed half a second later by 3 of Do-hyun's security team. What happened in the next 90 seconds was fast, brutal, and entirely one-sided. The man from the garden, who had clearly been told this would be a simple intimidation job and nothing more, found himself outnumbered and overpowered before he could even reach for whatever he'd been carrying in his jacket. Tae-hyun reached Naomi first, pulling her back behind him with an arm across her shoulders. His whole body angled between her and the chaos, and the look on his face as he scanned her for injuries was something Naomi had genuinely never seen on him before. Not once in all the years she'd known him, including the worst of their early days together. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough, his hands moving over her arms, checking for injuries she didn't have. "I'm fine," Naomi said, breathing hard, the dye rod still clutched in one shaking hand. "Kihyun, is he safe?" Do-hyun's team got to the school before anyone else could. "He's already with my mother at the estate, under guard." Tae-hyun's jaw was tight. "I should have moved them sooner. I'm sorry. I should have seen this coming the second I walked into that boardroom this morning." The man from the garden was on the ground now, restrained. His earlier calm completely gone, replaced by the desperate, fast-talking energy of someone who understood exactly how much trouble he was actually in. "I was just told to scare her," he said quickly, to anyone who would listen. Director Choi said no one hurt, just scared enough to leave. "That's all I was told," Director Choi Tae-hyun repeated quietly. And something in his voice made the man on the ground flinch. He turned to Do-hyun. "Where is he?" "That's the problem, sir," Do-hyun said, his usual easy humor entirely absent now. "He's gone. Left the building right after the board meeting this morning. Hasn't answered his phone since, and his car hasn't shown up on a single camera in the last 3 hours. He's running," Tae-hyun said. "Or regrouping," Do-hyun said. "A man like Director Choi doesn't run without a plan for what comes after." It took 3 days for Choi Dae-sung to surface. And when he finally did, it was not in hiding, not on the run, but standing calmly in front of a small gathering of journalists outside the Baeko Group's headquarters. A move so brazen that even Tae-hyun, watching the footage in real time from his car, felt a grudging flicker of disbelief at his cousin's audacity. Dae-sung had decided in the end that his only path to survival was to control the story before anyone else could. And so he stood in front of the cameras with his calm, trustworthy face fully intact and announced that he was deeply concerned about the mental stability of his cousin. The heir to one of Korea's most respected business groups, who had, in the last week, cancelled a long-planned and economically critical marriage alliance, made wild and unsubstantiated accusations against senior family leadership, and was now apparently claiming to have fathered a secret child with a foreign woman he had not seen in 7 years. It was, Tae-hyun had to admit, watching it unfold, a genuinely skillful lie built exactly the way Dae-sung built everything, from just enough real detail to sound plausible to anyone who didn't know better. It worked for almost 6 hours. It stopped working the moment the Bae Corpus Group's own internal security logs, the ones Tae-hyun's team had spent 4 sleepless days assembling, were quietly delivered to 2 separate investigative journalists who had spent years trying and failing to get any real information out of the notoriously closed Bae Kutuos organization. The logs included the original payment records to the forgery specialist from 7 years ago. They included the phone intercepts. They included security footage from the community garden, time-stamped and unmistakable, showing the exact man currently in police custody getting out of a car registered to a shell company with 3 layers of ownership, all eventually tracing back, with enough patience, to Troy Dae-sung's personal accounts. By the time the story broke publicly, it broke completely, the way only a story built on 7 years of careful, patient documentation can break, leaving absolutely nowhere for its central figure to hide. Troy Dae-sung was arrested 2 days later, not for the betrayal itself, which carried no easy criminal charge attached to its specific cruelty, but for the attempted kidnapping of a minor and the orchestration of it through a hired criminal contact, charges serious enough that even his decade of careful relationship building inside the Baeko group couldn't soften the fall. His final conversation with Tae-hyun happened in a small grey visitation room through a thick pane of glass, and it lasted less than 4 minutes. "I did it for the family," Dae-sung said, his calm mask finally completely gone, replaced by something almost pleading. "Everything I did to protect what your father built. You almost had a 6-year-old boy put in a car," Tae-hyun said quietly. "There is no version of protecting this family that includes that. You didn't do this for my father. You did this for yourself, and you let me grieve for 7 years over a lie you told to keep your own plans intact. Tae-hyun, I'm not coming back," Tae-hyun said, standing up. "Not to visit, not to listen to whatever justification you've built for yourself in here. I have a son now. I'm not wasting another minute of his childhood on you." He walked out, and he did not look back. The wedding to Oh Soo-min, of course, never happened. And to everyone's genuine surprise, Chairman Oh himself seemed almost relieved when the engagement formally ended, admitting privately to Tae-hyun's mother that his daughter had never wanted the marriage either. That both of their families had been pushed into the alliance by men more interested in business stability than in either of their children's happiness. Oh Soo-min, freed from an arrangement she'd quietly dreaded for years, sent Tae-hyun a brief, surprisingly warm message a few weeks later, wishing him well, and Tae-hyun, reading it on his phone late one night, felt nothing but genuine relief on her behalf. His mother, Han Mi-suk, took the longest to process everything. The way matriarchs who have spent their entire lives believing they understood the architecture of their own family tend to take the longest to accept that they missed something, this large hiding in plain sight for an entire decade. She sat with Naomi for the first time 3 weeks after Dae-sung's arrest, in a quiet sitting room at the family estate. The two women alone. The silence between them heavy with 7 years of things neither had ever said to each other. "I asked my son once if you knew what we were," Han Mi-suk said finally. "I meant it as a warning. I see now it should have been an apology instead." "You don't owe me an apology, Hanim," Naomi said carefully. "I owe you several," the older woman said. "But I will start with this one. I am sorry it took my own family 7 years and a 6-year-old safety on the line before anyone bothered to find the truth you were trying to tell us the whole time. It was not forgiveness, not yet, not completely, but it was the first real crack in a wall that had stood between them since the very beginning. And Naomi, watching the older woman's careful composure soften by exactly that much, found herself, for the first time, believing that whatever came next might actually have room for her in it. Kyun, for his part, adjusted to the sudden enormous shift in his world with the specific resilience of a child who is fundamentally certain of his mother's love and therefore has a remarkably steady foundation to absorb everything else. He met Tae-hyun properly for the first time 3 days after the incident at the workshop in the quiet garden of the family estate, Naomi standing close but giving them space. And the conversation that followed was, by every account afterward, almost unbearably simple for something that had taken 7 years and an entire family's collapse to arrive at. "My mom says you're my dad," Kaeon said, examining Tae-hyun with the same serious, unhurried attention he gave everything, including tomato plants and unfamiliar dogs. "I am," Tae-hyun said. "I didn't know about you until very recently. If I had known, I would have come sooner. I want you to know that." Kaeon considered this for a long moment. "Are you the reason the puppy man came to the garden?" The directness of it, the casual, devastating clarity only a 6-year-old can deliver, hit Tae-hyun harder than anything Dae-sung had said to him through that visitation room glass. "Not because of anything I did," he said carefully. "Because of someone in my family who didn't want me to find you. He's not going to bother you or your mum ever again. I promise you that." "Okay," Kaeon said, the same simple, total acceptance he'd offered Tae-hyun in his bedroom doorway weeks earlier. Then, after a pause, with the abrupt subject change that belongs only to small children. "Do you know anything about dogs? I know that I'm going to get you one if your mother says it's allowed." Kaeon turned immediately and with great purpose toward Naomi. "Mom? Mom, he said he's getting me a dog." "Did he?" Naomi said, raising an eyebrow at Tae-hyun over her son's head, the first genuine, unguarded smile crossing her face in longer than she could remember. "I did say that," Tae-hyun admitted. "I should have checked with you first." "You absolutely should have. I'll get you 2 dogs," Tae-hyun said to Keen with the perfectly straight face of a man who had spent his entire life negotiating impossible deals and had just discovered the most important negotiation of his career involved a 6-year-old and household pets. Tae-hyun. "Fine. 1 dog. A small one, onin senis." Naomi laughed, real and full, and the sound of it, after everything, settled something in Taehyun's chest that he hadn't realized had been clenched tight for 7 entire years. It took months, not days, for whatever existed between Naomi and Taehyun to become something they were both willing to name out loud. There was too much to rebuild for either of them to rush it. 7 years of grief and false stories and hard-won self-protection that didn't simply dissolve the moment the truth came out. Naomi kept her workshop, kept BC as her closest friend and unofficial business partner, kept the small, fierce independence she had built for herself and Keen out of necessity, and had no intention of handing over to anyone, not even a man who clearly adored her, simply because his name now appeared again in her life. Taehyun, for his part, spent those months doing something he had never once done in his entire adult life. He slowed down. He took Keen to soccer practice on Saturday mornings, badly disguised in a baseball cap that fooled absolutely no one, and learned, much to Doyeon's endless amusement, that running an empire that controlled half the shipping routes in the Yellow Sea had not prepared him in any way whatsoever for coaching a 6-year-old through the proper technique for a corner kick. "You're doing it wrong," Kaon informed him cheerfully during their 3rd disastrous Saturday session. "I built one of the largest logistics networks in East Asia," Taehyun said. "That doesn't matter for soccer," Kaon said with total confidence. "No," Taehyun admitted, watching his son run circles around him with a soccer ball, laughing in the bright Seoul sunlight in a way Taehyun had genuinely never imagined possible for himself just 2 months earlier. "I suppose it doesn't. It was on one of those Saturday afternoons, months later, with Kaon finally asleep after a full day of soccer, and the small dog Taehyun had eventually, inevitably, brought home anyway, that Naomi found him standing on her small balcony, looking out at a city that had once tried, through no fault of its own, to keep them apart for 7 entire years. "You're quiet," she said, joining him at the railing. "I was thinking about how close I came to never knowing either of you," Taehyun said. "If I hadn't walked out of that shop at exactly that moment, if you'd been 1 street over, if Kaon hadn't turned his head." "Don't do that," Naomi said gently. "Don't spend the rest of your life grieving the years we lost. We don't get those back, no matter how carefully we examine the math. We only get whatever comes next." Taehyun turned to look at her, the city lights catching the same careful, unguarded warmth in her eyes that had first stopped him cold in a tiny dye studio 8 years ago, long before any of this began. "Then let's make sure whatever comes next is worth all of it," he said. She didn't answer with words. She didn't need to. What started as a man stepping out of a jewelry store with a ring meant for someone he never loved had become, against every plan the Baeko Group's most careful architect had ever built, exactly what it should have been all along: a man, a woman, and a 6-year-old boy with serious eyes and an absolute, unshakable belief that the world generally turned out fine if you were patient enough and stubborn enough to wait for it. Lee Taehyun never did marry for power. He married 2 years later in a small, quiet ceremony at the same fabric workshop, where he'd once argued with a delivery man about the difference between navy and teal, with Doyeon serving as the world's most overdressed and overly emotional best man, and Kian, 8 years old by then, insisting on walking his mother down the short aisle himself because, as he informed everyone present with total seriousness, that was officially his job now. And somewhere in Seoul, a great deal smaller and a great deal quieter than the empire he'd once helped run, Choi Dae-sung sat in a prison cell, having finally learned the one lesson his decade of careful planning had never once accounted for: that some things, love among them, refused to stay buried, no matter how patiently and how carefully you try to bury them. If you enjoyed this story, imagine having 20 more unforgettable Mafia boss romances ready to read or listen to whenever you want. That's exactly why I created the Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. Inside, you'll find 15 complete stories, 20 audiobook versions, and 5 exclusive bonus stories that aren't available on YouTube. You can get instant access through the link in the description. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. Drop a like on this video and tell us in the comments what your favorite moment was, because we genuinely read every single one of them. This channel exists because of you, and we have so many more stories like this one coming your way. Stay close, stay subscribed, and we will see you in the very next story.